Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Marissa Bear, and I appreciate you joining today's webinar for the City of Northfield about air source heat pumps. Our webinar today, as I mentioned, talking about the air source heat pump technology with our goal to help you learn more about this technology and understand the options for you to consider when you're thinking about adding this equipment to your home. For our speakers today, we have Beth Kalistad from the City of Northfield and Dave Potterson from Xcel Energy, and want to give each of them the opportunity to briefly introduce themselves before we jump into today's topic. So Beth, if you could unmute yourself and just briefly introduce your role at the city, it would be great to hear for everyone on the call today. And Beth, you're on mute. It looks like you're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. We had a little too many mute buttons going on. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Beth Kalistad and I work on the Climate Action Plan for the City of Northfield.
Great, thanks Beth. And then Dave, if you want to unmute and introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm David Potterson. I'm a product developer at Xcel Energy. Done a lot of research into air source heat pumps and happy to share.
Great, thanks. So for logistics for our webinar today, everyone should be muted throughout the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Ask the Question feature, which is highlighted here on the screen. You should see it if you're using a computer, either on the right or left side toolbar. And enter your questions throughout the presentation, and then towards the end of the webinar today, we'll walk through and answer your questions directed towards the folks on our call best suited to speak to that. So first, want to do a poll for everyone, just to help our presenters understand the folks on the call and your familiarity with air source heat pumps. So you should see pop up on your screen a poll for you to answer that question. So if folks could put if you're very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar. And looks like we have a good number of people who, almost everyone's voted. So I'll close the poll and share the results for folks. So we have kind of a wide range. It looks like folks are either somewhat or very familiar with the air source heat pump technology, and then a handful of people who are still in discovery mode. So excited to have a wide variety. Hope our presenters today can answer your questions. So now I'm going to hand off to Beth Kalistad to talk more about Northfield's carbon-free goal and the climate action plan.
Thank you. So in November of last year, 2019, the City of Northfield adopted a climate action plan that is for the city properties, but really also for the whole community. And part of that plan, we have two main goals. One is to have 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, and then the other is to be carbon-free by 2040, and that does include some carbon sequestration and offset opportunities in that mix. As we were developing the climate action plan, we had an energy subcommittee that worked with Xcel's Partners in Energy program, which created this energy action jumpstart and different strategies. And as part of that, we wanted to do some outreach education and work with members of the community on topics that were of interest. And so that's kind of where some of this presentation for today came from. We're focusing on energy efficiency, renewable electricity, opportunities. And the big issue that we need to tackle by 2040 is how to shift away from natural gas. And we saw that for residential, certainly air source heat pumps could be a viable option as a way to shift to a more electric-based heating source as opposed to natural gas. And so we wanted to share some information today and help people start on that journey.
Thanks, Beth. And Beth, before we move on, we did just have a question clarifying on the goal. Curious if the goals that are outlined on the carbon-free goal is specific to for just the city government, or is it a community-wide goal?
That's a community-wide goal.
Great. Thank you. So now I'd like to hand off to Dave to talk more about the air source heat pump technology. As I mentioned, for folks on the call, please use the questions box as Dave goes through his presentation, and then towards the end, we'll be able to address your questions. So Dave, if you'd like to kick it off with I'm talking about the technology.
Sounds good. So again, David Porterson, I work for Xcel. Marissa, if you could go next slide. So first point I want to make is that heat pumps aren't new. They've been around for decades in the form of air conditioners and refrigerators. Anything that makes cold is essentially a heat pump. Really, the difference between an air conditioner and a heat pump is just the heat pump could run in reverse. So if you imagine a window air conditioner, it blows cold air in and blows hot air out. Well, a heat pump could do the same thing, but could also just reverse that cycle. So it blows hot air in and cold air out. And I wasn't sure how familiar everyone was with heat pumps. So that poll in the beginning was really informative. So I could try to, I could speed up on the more basic items and maybe spend a little bit more time on the more technical items. Next slide, please. So what is new in the heat pump world is cold weather performance. It used to be that heat pumps couldn't provide heating below 45 degrees outside, 45 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And that's no longer the case. This image on the left is marketing material from Mitsubishi, so I wouldn't bet my life on it. But they do have heat pumps that operate down to negative temperatures now. That's definitely true. So that's the newest update in this space. Next slide. However, cold climate heat pumps are very different than their predecessors. And the metrics that we use to measure the performance of them haven't caught up to the newest technology. The technology has moved much quicker than the metrics, the rating mechanisms we use in order to rate the performance of them. So don't rely on the traditional metrics. The image on your left is traditionally what we see when we buy a new piece of equipment. And the heating performance, which I'm talking about specifically, the metric that we use, the traditional metric is HSPF, is heating seasonal performance factor. So that number, the greater the number, the higher the energy efficiency. And it's supposed to describe how a heat pump will perform over a full heating season. But again, it's just not good enough these days. It hasn't been updated, and technology has gone much faster than the metrics that haven't been able to keep up. What you should use to find a cold climate heat pump is a list and specification by NEAP. NEAP is the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership. They keep their own specification and their own qualified products list. And that's a much better source to find heat pumps that will operate well in the cold. And again, when I say, I just want to be super clear about this, when I say that the metrics aren't a good indicator, what that means is that two different machines, two different heat pumps that look like, that have the same performance rating, HSPF rating, can have very different real world performance in cold climates. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens to heat pumps when things get cold outside. And two separate things happen. The first is that the capacity drops. So capacity is the amount of heat. So the colder it gets outside, the less heat that machine can actually provide to your home. Not only does the capacity drop, the amount of heat that it provides, but the performance drops. So that's the energy efficiency of the equipment. Energy efficiency is, right, the idea of energy efficiency is if you could use less energy to create the same end result. So when things get cold outside, you're using more energy for the heat pump to provide the same amount of heat, but then it can't even provide the same amount of heat. The capacity also drops. So the performance really does degrade at lower temperatures. And, you know, newer machines have much better performance, but when you get to temperatures like the polar vortex, like really cold, you know, deep winter northern climate temperatures, in retrofit scenarios, it's going to be very hard for any heat pump to provide all of the heating to our home. The only reason I separate retrofit from new construction is that new construction you could build super insulated and then you could build all electric, only a heat pump. But in retrofit scenarios with the existing building envelopes, they're just not as energy efficient. There's just not as much insulation. So in a retrofit scenario, it's really hard to heat your home entirely with a heat pump. The sweet spot is a cold climate heat pump, so one that could operate much colder than traditional heat pumps, but you could keep your natural gas heating system in your home for when it gets too cold outside. And you could see in this picture here, in this picture, I set that turnover temperature, so the temperature at which the heat pump will shut off and the natural gas heating will shut on at 25 degrees. That's a good sort of average value, but it's very equipment specific and home specific. So don't take that as gospel, right? That will be designed specifically for you. One more point about this slide is that this image makes it look like 50% at 25 degrees, 50% of the time you'll be using the heat pump and 50% of the time you'll be using your natural gas system. That's not true. So at this temperature, 25 degree turnover temperature, you'll be using the heat pump roughly 75% of the time. There's many more hours of relatively mild heating required throughout the entire year than of very cold temperatures. So, in my opinion, is that the best bang for the buck comes from you invest your money in a fancy electric heat pump system that could heat pretty cold, that could heat down in pretty cold temperatures, and you stick with a relatively simple natural gas backup system. There's no real need to install a condensing 96% efficient furnace if you're only using it 20, 25% of the time. Next slide, please. So it's really hard to give blanket advice, but there are a few key points that I can make. If you're currently heating with delivered fuel, propane or fuel oil, then definitely go dual fuel. Definitely choose an air source heat pump. If you're currently heating with electric resistance heat, same thing. Definitely use a heat pump. If you want to reduce your environmental impact, then definitely choose an air source heat pump. But if you only want to reduce your utility bills, then it's not so clear. The cost of running a heat pump versus natural gas are really basically on par with each other. Electricity is more expensive than gas on a, heating unit on a BTU basis, even though a heat pump is more efficient. So it sort of comes out a wash. If you want to prioritize cost effectiveness, you could play with that turnover temperature. So the temperature at which it changes from natural gas to heat pump. And if you are more concerned about your utility bills, you could raise it. So you can make the heat pump, you could use your natural gas system for relatively warmer temperatures, and that will help with the cost effectiveness of that. Next slide, please. Now there's two real form factors for air source heat pumps that you'll have to choose from. The first are ductless and the second is ducted. So ductless heat pumps, also known as mini split heat pumps, they have indoor units that get mounted on the wall, and each indoor unit has its own dedicated remote control, which is also a thermostat. So to heat your entire home, you'll obviously need multiple indoor units spread throughout in different rooms. And each indoor unit has either its own outdoor unit, or you could have multiple wall units, indoor units connected to a single outdoor unit. The opposite of that is a ducted heat pump. So a ducted heat pump, you have one outdoor unit with a coil that goes into basically your furnace, and it could provide heating and cooling to through your existing duct system. Next slide, please. Really not, should be a pretty simple decision process. If you don't have ducts, then definitely go ductless. If you do already have ducts, then probably the best thing is to use them. Especially if you have a central air conditioner already, then replacing a central air conditioner with a heat pump unit uses all the same equipment, uses the same refrigerant lines, the same coils going into your home, but it'll enable heating from that machine as well, in addition to cooling. One caveat to that is if your ducts are really improperly sized, if they're way too small, then that may be an opportunity to go ductless for you. But again, that's very home specific, so I can't really give any advice on that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you a little about ductless heat pumps now. Next slide. So the one key thing I want to get across about ductless heat pumps is that if you are looking to save energy, set it and forget it does not work with ductless heat pumps. Sorry, I tried to get fancy with my slides. So Marissa, can you go through, keep going, and one more. Okay, so this is the end result slide. The theoretical savings of using a ductless heat pump are super high. The modeled savings of using a ductless heat pump are super high. Everything looks like it should save a ton of energy. But in multiple field tests, we've seen over and over again that in reality, they often don't. Next slide, please. And the reason that they don't save energy in real life, oftentimes, is not because the equipment isn't capable of saving energy or isn't energy efficient. It's because of the controls. The controls for ductless heat pumps really are a problem. Every remote control that controls an indoor unit is also a thermostat. So you set the temperature that you want on it, and you could turn the unit on or off and do a whole gamut of control options from that remote control. But you also have an existing heating system in your home controlled by something else. So you have two separate heating systems that are constantly fighting with each other, but they don't even know that they're fighting with each other. They don't know that the other heating system even exists. Adding on to that problem is that ductless systems, it's taking the temperature right in that room, and many existing heating systems only have one thermostat for the whole house. So they're taking, not only are they fighting with each other, and not only are they not aware that the other system exists, but they're taking temperature readings in different places in the home. So it really becomes a little bit of a mess in terms of controls. Next slide, please. So I'm going to rewind for a second and say what we want, right? The ideal solution is that we want the heat pump to provide all the space heating up until some low temperature where it can't provide enough, right? It just can't physically put out enough heat. And then we want the existing heating system to turn on only in that case. The simplest way to replicate that is just to keep the heat pump set a little bit higher. So whatever temperature you want it to be in your home, that should be the temperature of the heat pump. And then your existing system, you could turn down roughly 4 degrees. You could play with that. But it takes a sort of constant management of this in order to actually see the energy savings from the heat pump. Right? This is the simplest, the sort of best option we have to ensure that the heat pump is providing most of the heating, but it's not, there's lots of factors. So, if you have other people in your house, if you have children, right, this is an easy thing to get wrong. It does take a sort of active management. Next slide, please. However, integrated controls are coming. So integrated controls are when the thermostat or the remote control for the ductless heat pump can actually communicate to your existing heating system. And actually, to be clear, they're here already. They exist. You could buy them. The problem is that the market is super fragmented, so every manufacturer has a sort of proprietary product. Some manufacturers have products, other manufacturers don't. Depending on the model heat pump you buy, you may or may not be able to do this. And contractors are, I presume, I haven't spoken to an HVAC contractor in a little while, but I think it would be extremely difficult to find a contractor that was prepared or knew enough about these controls to actually install them. So the market for these controls, even though the controls do exist, is still super nascent. But in the next few years, we really expect to have some more clarity on it. There's a couple of research projects. Xcel, we're doing a research project on it. And NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, they're doing some research projects on it. So we should have some more clarity in the next few years. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to central or ducted heat pumps. So historically, with central heat pumps, you had basically 2 options. You could go with a heat pump instead of a central air conditioner, which was very close to cost. A heat pump upgrade is pretty nominal compared to the cost of an air conditioner. So this basically the same cost as a central air conditioner, but you get very poor performance. You get very poor heating performance out of that machine. Or you could get a fully variable speed, high-end heat pump machine for your whole home, but it would cost you really a lot of money, right? It costs roughly 4 times as much as a basic heat pump. So there was no in-between. Next slide, please. But now there is an in-between. So now there's this sort of new class of central heat pump, which is the C on the bell curve, the sweet spot of performance and cost. It's the Subaru, right? So it's in between the two options and sort of the best bang for the buck. I do have some some examples here. So there's a Bosch system, there's a Daikin system, there's a Carrier system. There's definitely also a Mitsubishi system. I'm just not intimately familiar with that one, so I didn't put it on. But these are machines that cost $6,000 to $8,000 for a retrofit instead of $5,000 for a central air conditioner. And at that cost, you get roughly 80% of the performance of the higher end systems, but at only 40% of the cost. So these are very good. This is the sweet spot, in my humble opinion. Next slide, please. So a couple other considerations when installing a central heat pump. Unlike ductless systems, which take constant management of the controls, a central system, you don't need to worry about that at all. The contractor, when they install it, will program into the thermostat that changeover temperature. So all you need to do is plug in what temperature you want it in your home, and the thermostat will control which system, whether it's using the heat pump to provide heat or your existing natural gas system to provide heat. The thermostat will do that automatically. Again, if you're more concerned about cost savings, you could choose a slightly higher turnover temperature. And if you're more concerned about environmental impact, then you could choose a slightly lower turnover temperature. Please, please, please make sure your contractor performs a manual J calculation. Manual J just means that they're actually measuring what your house needs in terms of equipment sizing. It's extremely important to get your ducts sized correctly. I bought a house last year, and I was super happy. It had a heat pump that had one of these middle road heat pumps installed in it already. Had a zone system. It looked fancy. I was really excited about that. The heat pump never runs at partial speed. It's supposed to run at just slow speed when it's not very cold out. It never runs at lower speed. It only runs at full blast all the time because the ducts are too small. So it's really important to get your duct sizing right. And the last point I'll make about central systems is that it's always important to make sure that your ducts that are in uninsulated spaces, like your attic, it's always important that they're insulated. But with variable speed systems, it's even more important. You'll lose even more energy to your attic if your insulation is subpar. And I know I didn't really clarify about variable speed systems. I was a little bit concerned about time, but maybe I'll take some time now and talk about that. The traditional super expensive heat pumps they're fully variable speed systems, but they need fully variable speed everything. So you need a matched fancy air handler with a matched fancy outdoor unit with a matched fancy proprietary thermostat. You can't go out and buy a Nest and plug it into one of these high-end machines. If you buy a Carrier high-end system, you need Carrier's special thermostat. And the reason that these were designed that way is specifically so these machines could run at variable speed, at lower speeds. But to run at lower speeds, every piece of equipment needs to know what the other equipment is doing. So it all needs to work well together. And maybe I'll rewind even more and just say, variable speed's really good. It saves you a lot of energy. It's quieter. There's no downside. What you want variable speed systems. It's better in almost every way than a single speed system. And again, these old classic systems to get variable speed was a $20,000 upgrade or installation cost, and everything had to be matched perfectly to each other. These new middle ground central heat pump systems have the ability to run at variable speed independently of the other components. So you could just replace the outdoor unit, and that could run at variable speed without having a dedicated thermostat or without having a dedicated matched, very expensive, fancy air handler or a furnace together with it. So when I say variable speed, that's what I'm referring to. Next slide, please. We do have some rebates available. These are them. So up to $450 for a central heat pump system. We do have a ductless rebate available. Right now it's $200. We're proposing to increase that to $300 in 2021. And of most applicability to this presentation is if you have electric resistance heat, we're proposing a $600 rebate for a ductless system to displace that. Again, that's 2021, and we haven't gone through. We have to see what the commission comes back with, everything gets approved, but it's promising that these will come to fruition. Next slide, please. And that's all I got. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Really great information. We've had a handful of questions come in through the webinar and walk through. And I know for folks looking at their watches, approaching time, but if you can stay on, please do. Otherwise, we'll get through these questions and then can also share answers after the fact. So the first question we have, Dave, is what is the cutoff between a cold climate heat pump versus a normal heat pump, and how different are they?
So that's sort of a good question. There's no set in stone cutoff. And actually, at the moment, I haven't looked at Meek's air source heat pump specification in a little while. They've clearly defined what they classify as a cold climate heat pump on their website in that specification. So really, I would refer to that. It's not super fresh in my mind right now, so I can't cite. I don't know what that is. But if you check on that website, that would be the probably best guidance on that.
Great, thank you. The next question is related to new construction installations. And when doing a new construction installation, are the heat pump controls integrated already, or do you still have to have a separate backup heating system for those low outside temperatures, or is that kind of just built in when you have a new home that's built?
Definitely would not take that for granted. So just because it's new construction, I would not assume that has been in place. With ductless systems, it's very unlikely. With a ducted system, it's a lot more likely that the contractor had, if they did install a natural gas system, that it would communicate between the two. But I wouldn't take any of that for granted.
Got it. Next question is related to upgrading. So do you need to upgrade your current forced air furnace to work with a new heat pump?
So that's a great question. That is dependent on the exact machine you buy. So depending on which of these if you go with the middle ground system, well, okay, let me back up for a second. If you go with the cheap system, then you probably don't, right? It'll be on and off. It'll run at full speed or zero speed. It won't run. If you want to go with the super high-end system, the $20,000 system, then definitely. You can't just buy a single component of that $20,000 system. You have to buy an entirely matched system. And if you want to go somewhere in the middle, that sweet spot, the Subaru style heat pump, then it depends on the manufacturer specific, like which exact system that you have. I think almost all of them, though, if you only have a single stage furnace or air handler, so if it only has one speed on or off, you would at least do yourself a lot of good to upgrade to at least like a stage air handler or furnace. So if it has 1, 2, or 3 settings, like high, medium, low, that would do you a lot of good. But it depends. But the exact requirements would depend on which of those middle ground systems you have.
And Dave, to that question, would a contractor be able to recommend the upgrade to the furnace when considering a new heat pump?
Yes, that falls squarely on them, right? That's something that's they should be up to speed on and know how it works and how to install it. That being said, it's sometimes hard to find good help these days. So, do your due diligence on picking a contractor, but that is something that really is dependent on the exact machine. So there's no way that in a webinar like this, like there's no blanket advice that can be given on that. It's really specific to the machine.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Next question that's come in is, can a heat pump for air heat be combined with a water heater?
Yes, it can. There are combined space heating, water heating heat pump technologies. I'm going to keep it on high level here, but research has shown that they are capable of saving. They're definitely capable of saving significant amounts of energy, but the system configuration and setup is very complicated. So right now, it's very hard for a normal contractor to sort of do this. When research institutions perform this research, they engineer everything to work perfectly, right? And then they do this research, say, hey, we found a bunch of energy saving. In the real world, we're not there yet, right? A normal contractor just can't handle that yet. It's not widespread knowledge at all. So short answer, well, it's not, I guess it's not so short of an answer, but technology is coming, and hopefully it's going to get a lot easier and more simple for normal contractors to be able to install equipment like that.
Great, thank you. We talked a lot about, or I should say you talked a lot about air source heat pumps as it relates to cold climate and for heating, but can you talk a little bit more about the ability for cooling and the applicability to cooling the home as compared to a traditional central air conditioner?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry, cooling is just much more simpler. Any heat pump that you provide, or any heat pump that you buy, can provide cooling. So all of these systems will provide cooling, and that cooling will be roughly proportional to the efficiency of the heating system, right? So if you go middle ground, then you'll get middle ground cooling efficiency. If you go high end, you'll get high end cooling efficiency as well. I don't know if there's any more specific I can get on that.
Great, thanks. You had mentioned kind of middle of the road pricing for that 6,000 to 8,000 price tag. Is that the price for a brand new system or for a retrofit to an existing forced air system?
That's the price for that's the price to replace if you needed to replace your central air conditioner. So if your central air conditioner went kaput and you called the contractor and had them replace it, but you chose one of these heat pumps, that would be the price of one of these heat pumps. And that, again, depending on which exact model you choose, some of them you could still use your existing air handler / furnace, others not. You would also need to replace that. And that is included in that range. So the upper end of that range, $8,000, is you probably get a new outdoor unit, a new air handler / furnace, and also probably a new thermostat to control.
Thank you. Just looking through questions here, we've had quite a few come in, and knowing time, Dave, would you be able to answer maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up today?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So looking at the questions, there's been a few coming in related to contractors. One participant mentioned that they had a friend who tried to work with a contractor, and none of them had done that manual J calculation that you had referenced. And a few others had mentioned that maybe some of the contractors they've worked with just aren't familiar with this technology. Do you have any insight into the emergence of this technology, and as contractors get more training or develop that knowledge, kind of what that landscape is looking like?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question completely, but I'll do my best to answer. First of all, every contractor will know what a manual J is. They often cut corners and use rules of thumb to do their work, but they're supposed to be doing a manual J every single time they do an installation. So don't let them tell you that that's like something new that they're not familiar with yet. That's not 100% not true. If you insist on manual J, they should know what it is and do it if you insist on it. Like, that's their job. So that's first of all. And then matching the variable speed, the sort of like middle ground variable speed heat pumps to the manual J is a different question. And I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't think it's a big deal at all. It's just a matter of airflows, capacity and airflows. I don't think that should present a problem to any decent contractor, for sure.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I probably didn't do the best job summarizing the, we had a few different comments come in related to contractors. And just want to let folks know, Dave asked one more question, and for people who haven't received a response to their submitted question, we'll follow up with written responses. We do have your email address from when you registered and can share those answers with people who are on the webinar and may not have submitted that question, and then for access after the fact. So the last question, just want to put out to you, Dave, is what is the life expectancy in terms of years for these types of systems? So for example, that mid-range system that you described, what can a consumer expect for how long that equipment should be lasting?
Yeah, so life expectancy is the same as for any like central system. So roughly on the order of 20 years, 15 to 20 years is I think I don't remember exactly what we claim in our technical assumptions, but I think it's something like that.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And I'm going to kind of start wrapping up. So again, just want to let folks know on the call, if you have submitted a question that we haven't sent a response yet, we'll provide a follow-up to you directly, and then also share the questions and answers to everyone on this webinar, in addition to those who may not have been able to attend today to access those answers. So to wrap up today, one thing I wanted to note that David mentioned rebate opportunities from Xcel Energy, but there are also financing opportunities to make these types of upgrades. Two resources we like to share with folks is the Home Energy Loan, which is a low interest loan for energy improvements up to $20,000. And then Minnesota Housing also has a secured and unsecured loan option for up to $15,000 for energy upgrades. And the website we have here that I will share a link with as well is the Minnesota Lending Center. You can contact them, let them know what type of project you're interested in, and they can do the qualification and help you determine what best loan you should choose to move forward with the project. So just to let folks know, this is an investment you need to make, but there are financing opportunities out there for you to be able to move forward. So that concludes our webinar today. I want to thank everyone who's attended today, and thank you to our presenters, Beth and Dave. Really appreciate your information. Dave, I think really great information and review of this technology that is coming out, and thanks to everyone who attended and submitted really great questions for us to learn more. As I mentioned earlier via chat, that this webinar has been recorded. We will post the webinar recording after today, as well as share the PDF of the slides, and then also questions and answers that have been submitted through this webinar for you to access. So thank you again to everyone, and appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot.